Good afternoon, everybody. It's a little strange, but if you could move your attention over here just for a couple of minutes. It's wonderful to have you all here. It's wonderful to see such a full room at this point in our history as we slowly emerge from this terrible pandemic. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first in a series of 3 events on the topic Central America in Focus, a series sponsored by our new Georgetown Americas Institute. As you may know, if you've seen the announcements, we have great ambitions for the Institute, which will tie together our existing strengths here at Georgetown across campus, and we are confident help to establish Georgetown as a premier platform for dialogue, research, and impact around the key challenges facing Latin America and the hemisphere as a whole. So I'm delighted to welcome you all as allies in this greater effort, and especially to welcome our distinguished panelists, including Dr. Alejandro Werner, the founding director of the Institute. So more about Alejandro in a moment. First, a little more background, if you'll indulge me. The Institute has grown out of a multi-year consultation with faculty and other internal and external stakeholders, centered on the question, how can we at Georgetown best leverage our academic strengths, DC location, and Jesuit identity to make our university a leader in the Americas? Well, thanks to a generous founding gift from Rolando and Monica Gonzalez-Bunster, we are ready to attempt to answer that question in practice. The Institute's work, which is beginning to unfold, will focus on 4 themes that correspond to areas of faculty strength and student interest, and also align with Georgetown's mission as a Jesuit institution committed to the common good. Themes you'll be familiar with, whatever region you study, whatever your disciplinary background or interest, themes of governance and the rule of law, economic growth and innovation, social and cultural inclusion, and, of course, the environment and sustainability. The topic of our event series this fall, the challenges facing Central America, of course, engages all of these themes, and we'll have a chance to delve into them today and with 2 further events over the coming weeks, bringing together stakeholders across sectors for conversations about the policy, financial, and civil society dimensions of the problems and opportunities facing the region. Today, under the heading of Rethinking the Northern Triangle, we have a group of leading experts to discuss the linked economic, migration, and human rights agendas confronting Central America, with a focus on Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Let me note in passing that today we mark the 32nd anniversary of the murder of 6 Jesuits and 2 laywomen during the Civil War in El Salvador. A reminder that human rights concerns, like the others we'll be looking at today and throughout these series, are still very much with us, not just in this region, but across our world. So thank you all for being here. Like you, I look forward to the conversation, and I'm especially delighted that you, Alejandro, will be moderating, even though you only officially assume your duties in January. So thank you for being here. Just a couple words of introduction. Dr. Alejandro Werner recently completed almost 9 years as director of the Western Hemisphere Department at the International Monetary Fund. A native of Mexico with a PhD in economics from MIT, he has had an accomplished career in Mexican government, where he rose to the position of undersecretary in the Ministry of Finance, as well as in the private sector and in international organizations. Alejandro has published widely on financial, economic, and policy questions, always with a keen eye for the wider political and social contexts within which they unfold. He's taught at Yale and at the IE Business School in Madrid. In 2007, he was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. Now, at the IMF, Alejandro oversaw a team of about 140 staff engaged in complex relationships with the 34 member countries from the Americas, the Caribbean, including the US and Canada. All of the Americas. And that hemisphere-wide perspective is something you, Alejandro, will bring to our community as we work to create a truly America's-wide platform for engagement, one that builds on Georgetown's location in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. not just as the capital of the United States, but as a crossroads for dialogue and collaboration around the critical regional and global challenges facing both Latin America and the hemisphere as a whole. So Alejandro, it's great to have you with us. Please join me in welcoming Alejandro Werner and our panelists to the stage.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much, Tom, for those very kind words. I'm thrilled to join Georgetown University and to be with you, really launching this new initiative and thinking about all the possibilities we can achieve together here at Georgetown, together with our partners here in Washington and also throughout the region. So let me turn directly to today's panel. I think we are opening up a very interesting series about a region that has gone through a very difficult half a century, and I think the challenge of the panelists today will be to a little bit to lay out the situation in Central America, both from the point of view of development and also from the point of view of the migratory challenges towards the U.S., and also explore some ideas on how these countries can actually look for a new path forward in the next few decades. So let me introduce the panel. First, we have Catherine Donato. She's a Donald Herzberg Professor of International Migration and Director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. She has examined the migration issue from many angles, and I think we couldn't have anybody better to frame the Central America migration issue for us, and hopefully we will also get some comments on how the U.S. immigration system can be reformed to significantly improve the situation at the border and for the U.S. also to reap the benefits of this migratory process. To my right, Jose Miguel Vivanco. He's the director of Human Rights Watch Americas Division and general expert on Latin America. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Jose Miguel worked as an attorney for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the Organization of American States. In 1990, he founded the Center for Justice and International Law, an NGO that files complaints before international human rights bodies. Vivanco has also been an adjunct professor of law here at Georgetown and also at the School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He studied law at the University of Chile and Salamanca Law School in Spain, and also he holds an LLM from Harvard Law School. Then also to my right, Zeina Boursako is the Director of Strategy and Operations for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. She was most recently the Country Director for Central America, covering Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, where we worked together in many important issues throughout Central America. In her position, she oversaw the programs, research, and funding for these 6 nations. She's a native of Senegal. She joined the World Bank in 2004 and has held several positions, including as economist for Brazil, Jamaica, and Bolivia. Most recently, she served as manager of macroeconomic and fiscal management for East and Central Africa. She earned a PhD in economics from UPenn. Also, she has a degree in finance and economics from LSE, and she has authored significant papers. Let me just wrap up this introduction saying, as I said at the beginning, that I'm sure that this title that we use for this session has been used in the last 50 years many times. The region, if you look at GDP per capita in 2020, is almost at the same level that it was in 1960. When you look at poverty ratios, I mean, poverty hovers around 60% in Honduras and Guatemala, 40% in El Salvador. The population of these countries that have left their natural country is around 10%. This number is almost 20% in the case of El Salvador. And obviously, when you look at income distribution measures, child mortality, et cetera, all these countries are in a very dire situation. So hopefully we will begin to explore a little bit and to establish a diagnosis of the migration issue and the development challenges of these countries, and hopefully we will come out today with some ideas on how both locally these countries can start to design and generate consensus for some policies to bring them out of this development trap, and also how the international community can help to actually solve these very deep and rooted social problems in what has been called the Northern Triangle. So we will start with Catherine, followed by Seynabou, and then Jose Miguel will outline many of the human rights issues that the region is facing, and also that the migrants are facing at the US-Mexican border. So please, Catherine.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for attending today. I'll start with the very big picture. So people are on the move increasingly now compared to 20 years ago. And this is true whether you look at, you think about migrants, people who are voluntarily leaving for economic, high-skilled work around the world, but this is also true for people who are forced to move. So UNHCR's latest numbers, more than 80 million people have been forced to move, many more internally displaced than refugees, but still 25 million refugees. And many people who are on the move are people who don't easily fit into these categories. And that's really one of the sort of the new aspects of migration that has emerged in the last 20 years, is that the motivations to move are mixed, and this is especially true in Central America. And so, and you can see that by journalistic accounts of people who are at the southern US border, from any of the 3 countries in northern Central America, for example, when people say, I can't survive in my home country because I can't find sustainable work, but I also cannot live there because I'm afraid. I'm afraid for my kids to go to school. I'm afraid for me to leave the house. So that's the big picture. We are living at a time, and I believe probably for the next 20 years, we're going to be looking at continued increases of people on the move, with the recognition not only that many countries around the world are complex, that there's a lot of conflict, there are these interactions between conflict, migration, and development, and you have now at least larger awareness of environmental displacement, whether that's because of big cyclones or big hurricanes that hit people and where they live, or it's because of slowly changing environmental conditions that have degraded places and made it impossible for people to live. So that's the big story. With respect to Central America, especially those 3 northern countries, but well, let's stay there for a minute. As you mentioned, or as Tom mentioned, in the 1980s, there was civil war in El Salvador and Guatemala, to a lesser extent in Honduras, but there was a lot of disruption in the area as a result of internal strife and conflict. And that's what initially pushed Guatemalans and especially El Salvadorans out. And that was the big push factor that all of a sudden in US statistics you could see by 1990. You had Guatemalans and El Salvadorans rising in terms of their numbers every year in the 1990s. El Salvador and Guatemala have been national origins that have reached, in the US, the top 5 immigrant national origins. They're always in the top 10, but sometimes in these last 20 years, they've been in the top 5. So that big push then became sustained by other new migrants coming, not only related to that initial 10 to 15 years of very significant internal strife, but then other things. There were hurricanes in the 1990s that pushed people from those countries into the US, and many of them received temporary protective status in the US and still have that status, although that's not permanent. And then other kinds of more slowly oriented processes. So for example, when people initially left, entire families did not initially leave. Many children were left back with the grandparents. And so what we've seen in the last 20 years now, especially the last 10, is the emergence of unaccompanied children showing up at various borders between, let's say, El Salvador and the US, but showing up largely to reunite with at least one parent who is in the US. So that's a new dynamic in the last 10 to 15 years that really is secondary to that initial push out. And then, of course, the networks between people who are there and people who are here, and the information that passes through those networks, and the ability of people to find jobs in the US without authorization. All of this then helps fuel what started as really conflict-oriented or conflict-push migration to now a very institutionalized, let's say, outflow of people from these countries to the United States. So once migration gets to this level, I'm using the word institutionalized flow because now it's extremely difficult, much more complicated to shut it down, should the US want to shut it down, and to control it. And our goal now in the 21st century in most countries around the world is to manage migration in a safe and efficient way. So the question is, how do we do that? And if we think about it from the perspective of the US and even Mexico, which has now become a country of destination for many as people transit through and can't get all the way through for various reasons. But for the US, we have had policies in place that many of them haven't changed for decades. And if they have, they've been just very small changes around the edges. And so and in the US, the way immigration policy and law gets developed is through Congress. And so if you do anything big, like change a visa category system, you have to do that through congressional legislation. And that, as we know, is a little bit difficult now to get, for most pieces of legislation, no less legislation related to either unauthorized migration or legal immigration. So the question is, what can we do? And I would like to think we could make congressional change, but I'm going to put that here for now because we could probably do hours and hours on that, and I'm not sure where we would get in terms of being able to manage more efficiently in the short run what's going on. So in the short run, there are some answers here. And so I am meeting, actually at this time, every week, except for this week, with the task force on migration from Northern and Central America. And this is a task force put together by experts, people not who in the past served in government, but they're also experts in the field, from Costa Rica all the way up to Canada, with the idea that we have to begin to consider this a region, and there are regional dynamics that if we could get our arms around these dynamics, we could do a much better job at managing. This is part of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and we've issued a series of reports. We have a few more left to go. One of the, so the broad perspective is a regional focus, but one of the things that I think all of us who entered this conversation know is that we in the US do not use legal pathways in dynamic ways. As I said, there's been no change largely to the system for decades. But that there are ways to use legal pathways. And there are a few ways that we could use legal pathways without getting Congress involved. And how do we do that? Well, there's one visa, for example, the H-2A, which is for agricultural workers, which has largely been a visa that Mexican-born have been using. And in fact, they didn't use it before, but in the last 20 years, their use of the H-2A has grown. And that is not numerically limited. And so if it's not numerically limited, then we don't need Congress, right, to increase the number of these sorts of visas. And maybe we can get creative in terms of not removing H-2As from Mexicans per se, but really assessing what kind of food worker and agricultural worker or set of occupations we need to be filled. And to think about expanding to countries in Northern Central America, that pathway. It's a little bit difficult because this is where working with the private sector will be very important, because in the US, the way the US law is written, those visas typically go to employers who project they will have a labor shortage, and then there's, finding the workers from the employer point of view. So we need the private sector to be involved here, but there are some creative ways to think about that. So using legal pathways, some of them in creative ways, I think is one way to do it. We don't have a legal pathway for care workers in the US, and we know the US is aging, and we also know we have that as well. Two final things. Global partnerships, there's a fair amount of discussion about countries like the US going to countries, let's say, like Honduras or Guatemala, and training workers, let's say healthcare workers of some sort. And then some proportion of them would come to the US for temporary work, and the other proportion would stay in Guatemala and be a trained healthcare worker. So that's another sort of creative solution, I think, that many of us are talking about. And then finally, I'll say, with respect to legal pathways, whether they're when they're temporary, that we have to think about how we can make them provisional. One of the things we've done in the past, we've always done in the past, is that temporary visas are temporary, and you go back. But that doesn't recognize that you might be going back and forth for 10 years and eventually develop family here and live your life here essentially, and there's no path. So provisional, I think, legal pathways or legal pathways that have some provision to become permanent over time with all sorts of contingencies, I think is also the future.
Very interesting. I mean, Zainabou, maybe going back a little bit now, back to the region. I mean, Catherine mentioned, I mean, the initial phases of the migratory move being triggered by civil wars, but also, I mean, this continuing process once you have a well-established native population here in the US, also being pushed by economic insecurity conditions, etc. So maybe, I mean, if we get a diagnosis of what's going on those areas in Central America as these push factors leading the population to come to the US to seek, I mean, a future for them and their families.
No, thank you, Alejandro, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about Central America. I wanted to start with a short account. One of my most vivid experience was visiting a returned migrant center in El Salvador. And there I had a conversation with a person who came at 4 years old to the US, grew up here, went to community college, but was illegal and then was deported. Where the story goes is not the deportation, is that when he was deported to El Salvador, he tried to make a go at it. He tried to teach English, he tried to go to call center, he tried to raise a family, and at the end wasn't able to find what he told me was, I didn't have a dream for me and my children. So he tried to come back illegally. And then when they deported him from the Mexican frontier, that's when I spoke to him. I think it speaks of the economic dimension of it, the development challenge part. Even somebody who goes there, try to make a go, cannot always go. And he talked about many things, like how his degrees weren't necessarily recognized, how basically culturally he was, by all accounts, Salvadoran, but he wasn't at the same time. So how he couldn't actually find a way to leverage his human capital and make a living. If we go back a little bit at the region and think about Central America, I think that COVID really showed the whole region that basically all the things that they had postponed in terms of structural reform were there waiting. And if anything, the crisis worsened them. This is a region, as Alejandro said, that basically had roughly, it was growing. It's growing on average 4%, but when you look at that growth, it doesn't have productivity growth. You had a little bit of labor productivity in Honduras and Guatemala that came from increase in human capital or increase or demographic dividend, but these are not growth that gives you good jobs that allow you to earn an income that reduces your poverty. This is a region that took a long time on the institutional reform, and I hope we get more onto that. This is a region that is marred by inequality. I remember one big shock is really looking at that poverty that is stubborn at incredibly high rate. And any sort of crisis, for instance, the elections in 2009 in Honduras, just gives you a dent of increase of 7% in poverty. So just anything will be there to just exacerbate that poverty. Same if you look at malnutrition rates. For children in Guatemala, it is at 47%. 47% of the children are stunted, which means that when they are learning, they cannot already absorb language. So you have those structural things that are stubborn. They were there before COVID. We knew about them. Just before the crisis happened, the World Bank did an assessment of the preparedness of the health systems in the whole of Latin America. Honduras was the worst prepared for the crisis. And then we started thinking about how to support them in dengue and chikungunya and Zika. But what we didn't know was that the mother of all of those crises was COVID. So it's not a surprise that it hit the region hard. So I really want to say that in as much as we've been talking about all these things for the longest time, there's an urgency to act now. Because in a sense, everything that led to the moment of now is even more poignant, is even more urgent to do something now. That's one. The second thing is that when you look at what COVID has done, it has really shown that those hard-won gains, wherever you saw them, for instance, if you look at the whole region in terms of their Gini inequality, for instance, El Salvador made stride. It's more equal than Guatemala or Honduras or even Nicaragua. But even those strides are very vulnerable. Like, for instance, we saw that 17% of people who were employed doing high-frequency phone survey, 17% up to now haven't gone back to work. And out of those, 60% will never go back to work. And when you take those numbers and you break them down, who's the most affected? Women. Who are the most affected? Young people. Who are the most affected? Afro-descendant or indigenous people, or people living in coastal area. All that says that if you just look at that impact, it has intergenerational cost, because if a woman, we know that if a woman has an income, then she's more likely to not take on gender-based violence in the house because she has an option. She's more likely to invest in her children's education. So if you look at youth, you know that in a region where you have a big proportion of what they call ninis, ni escuela ni trabajo, those people, you take them 1 year out of the school, you start getting into gangs, you start getting into pregnancy, with all the impact that has on your lifelong earnings, what it has on your children. And if you add to that the dimension of inequality or stunting, all that, it's like, it took forever to get here, and it was very easy to wipe it out. And even if you look at earnings, they're saying up to 2023 to get back to where we were. So I think that that's COVID. On top of COVID, while we were struggling, thinking, okay, how do we respond? How do we help unprepared health system deal with the crisis? You got ETA and IOTA, November 2020. And they came and in 2 weeks wiped out, if you take the Caribbean coast of Honduras and Nicaragua. And I remember we were very involved with the Garifunas communities that are in that coastal code, from Bluefields all the way to La Ceiba in Honduras. And the conversation we were having was about census, because you had the 2020 round of census, and how to make sure that you have proper participation of Afro-descendants so that they're well represented. It's important to know whether they're 10% or 15% or 4%. And this type, so they were talking about school, about access to services. By the time you had COVID, you had ETA and IOTA, the conversation were about food security. How can we eat? How can we eat today? How can we eat tomorrow? And so you just see the difference in this type of issues and the implication on human capital and then on productivity. So this all to say that if anything, when I said first it's an urgency of now, but second, we are in a much worse position in terms of those short-term impacts that go into the longer term and make it much harder. And how to make sure that those who are the most disenfranchised, those who are the most vulnerable, and I always say young adolescent, indigenous or Afro, or vulnerable to drop out of school. Those are the target population, whether they're women, whether they're guys, it depends. But really making sure that they stay up to school and they get those opportunities to get the skills and all. So that's something that we saw with COVID, and really the impact that you're having, I think that on natural disaster, the whole adaptation climate, that was something that we say, okay, we're trying to get growth. When we get growth, we're going to talk about green growth. But now you cannot say that. You have to do everything. And I think the way forward in terms of where this region is going is not having the choice. Because it's true. The way the economic development model is to export a lot of low-skilled workers to the US. And there's a big part of that is going to be very difficult to change because people have family here, they have network here. If you look at the migration pattern, you will see that there are more and more educated people who are going. It's not the poorest because it takes a lot of money to actually pay and go and so on. So there's a part you cannot really move. But there is a part that is one about economic development, about jobs, about violence, about being able to cross the territory to go get educated, about being able to safely get to jobs, about being able to dream of a better future for you and your family. And that's the question that right now we really have to take the opportunity of this rebuilding to make sure that it's green. It has to adapt. You go to the Nacaome Valley in Honduras, they tell you 50 days with no water. I come from Africa. I was there. You cannot stay. You're starving. You move because it's dry and there's no water. And water is something you cannot postpone to next year. So really, where are those burning points? And I really like your point about how can the private sector become a partner. There, what we're trying to do is really leverage those dams that were built a long time ago but never finished, so they're sitting there, do the added investment, generate a basic irrigation system, and rebuild a little bit the cover and help them get a living out of that, and get at least the private sector to come and put some money so that it becomes a much more sustainable cooperative, a much more sustainable system, and people can have a perspective. What are we doing? We're investing a lot on early childhood education because you know that if you spend time on the children, then they have a better chance to do well at school. But it's almost like it takes a whole of everything sort of approach to it. And you require a government that is able to do it, if you require continuity of the investment over time. And that's, I think, the part that is the hardest. Sometimes it's about capacity, how do you do it over time? But I think that these days, if we look at all regions in the world, the biggest threat is that the task is so hard that it's easiest to just say whatever needs to be said to get voted. But it will require a long and arduous job. It will require continuing to work on the green part, on the recovery part, on the inclusive part, and on the development part, all at the same time. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Jose Miguel, you have been, very active in singling out maybe, let's say, the backtracking of institution building in the region. Also, you have highlighted, I think, slippages in the construction of a true democracy. And also, I think you have been very active in denouncing another epidemic in Central America, that is corruption. So if you can, I mean, in your time, talk about how those issues are hampering the development of these societies. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, if you can also talk a little bit about the main human rights issues that and problems that present in the whole passage of migrants towards the U.S., I think it will be very useful for the audience.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It is a pleasure and honor to be here in this great company, and also among the first activities of this newly established center at Georgetown. And I wish I could give you some, a little bit more positive views after the wonderful presentations, but a little bit, I don't know, depressing ones regarding Central America. And I don't think we have mentioned Mexico. I'm planning to mention a couple of things about Mexico. But unfortunately, I have to share with you some also pretty depressive news about the region. I think we are facing really, really tough times. I'm quite pessimistic about the future. I have to be honest. I'm not coming here to try to, to pretend that that there are easy solutions or some policies that could be implemented and quick solutions for the region. Let me start by mentioning the case of Nicaragua, which is not part of the deal. I know that it's off the script. Not just because I have a friend from Nicaragua, but also because I think it's important in order to put things in context and to see how serious are the setbacks in Central America. The leader of Nicaragua, who is a dictator, Mr. Ortega, and his wife, the vice president, decided to run elections, ran once again for another election. He's the current president, a fourth term in office. And in order to make sure about the results of the election, he decided to essentially abduct each one of the presidential candidates that could eventually challenge and defeat him. So 7 potential presidential candidates are in, 6 of them in prison. Cristiana Chamorro is under house arrest. This is something unbelievable in the region. We have really, really tough times with military dictatorship, whatever. But the fact that in the 21st century, somebody could decide to run for a re-election and to arrest on fabricated charges in isolation, no due process, the competition, and continue with the schedule for the election, is something that it never happened. Now, one of the reasons why Ortega succeeded, because the election was this weekend, and he managed to get a result, and he's pretending that he's the new legitimate leader of Nicaragua, is, in my view, one of the reasons is that the status of democracy in Central America, the fact that you don't have a strong support, except for Costa Rica. Of course, we always have in Central America our beloved Costa Rica, and that uphold the principles of justice, human rights, democracy, and so on and so forth. But that is not enough. The rest of the region is actually is a real disaster, what is happening. The president of Honduras is accused of narco trafficking by prosecutors that are ongoing investigation. and many key members of his family are under criminal prosecution, some of them in detention in the US. And there are no institutions in Honduras, no independent judiciary. The police has been completely compromised. It's a country where nobody really knows whether you have 4,000 gangs members or 40,000 gang members, And those gangs are very dangerous, and they control neighborhoods. They run the show and extorting people. They engage in forced recruitment of minors and all sort of atrocities that I'm not going to, you could imagine the worst. I'm not going to enter into the details. But so that is Honduras, In Guatemala, the current government and the ruling party in Congress is determined to rule out the judiciary from any justice member or potential justice member who is not linked to corruption. I'm not sure whether my English is crystal clear. In other words, if you have some connections with mafias, you have a pretty good chance to become a judge in Honduras, and even better chance, greater chance to be at the top level. And so, the current administration in Guatemala, I'm referring to Guatemala, is on a mission to clean up, the whole justice system. So impunity is the rule for corruption, all sort of business. Forget about transparency. The last point is the current, I wanted to mention is the case of El Salvador, where you have Salvadorians have elected a populist leader, Mr. Bukele, who has a lot of support, apparently, according to the polls. According to the latest election for Congress, back in February, the results were actually impressive, with overwhelming support for this leader. And thanks to that support, he has managed to essentially decapitate the court system and the whole judicial system and whatever mechanisms that they've managed to build to ensure transparency is over. He's in a business to politicize the army and the police, which is very dangerous in the case of El Salvador. At the beginning of this event, our host was mentioning the anniversary, commemoration anniversary of the killings of the Jesuits in El Salvador. They went through a very, very bloody, horrible civil war. And they have managed to build a very weak democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, very weak democracy. But what the current government is doing is to dismantling everything. Now, let me jump quickly into what concerns me the most, that is Mexico. And concerns me because my sense, and it's very painful for me to say what I'm going to say, is that the current administration of President Biden is keeping the same type of approach or the same type of relationship that the previous president had with Mexico. In essence, and it's painful because I have many friends in the current administration, and I do believe that the current administration is, at least from a point of view of the rhetoric and the values, they represent very different from the previous administration in Washington. But in practical terms, what the current administration, the Biden administration, is doing with Mexico is making sure that they help the U.S. On one single issue, preventing migration to coming to the border, the U.S. border with Mexico. And in order to do that, the deal is essentially relying on a law enforcement approach, where Mexico has put 28,000 military officers involved in migration issues. No questions asked. You know what is the record of the Mexican army. We have done extensive reports as well at Human Rights Watch, but the United Nations and many other organizations of serious abuses. But the Biden administration is not, concerned about that, and is very silent on efforts conducted by the current government of Mexico to dismantle the rule of law in Mexico as well. But let me focus into migration now, and sort of more kind of constructive approach. If I were with a member of the Biden administration, I will give them a tip. I will say, why don't you help Mexico to build up a credible, sustainable, self-sufficient, and capable asylum system mechanism. I'm going to share with you some numbers, which are very easy to keep in mind. The asylum system in Mexico is completely dysfunctional. It's not up to the task. The last time that they had an upgrade on the legislation for asylum in Mexico, that was 10 years ago. They created a system that in the acronym in Spanish is COMAR, that is financed with $1 million. $1 million, 10 years ago. 10 years ago. The expectation was that the system will have to deal with 1,000 applicants for asylum. You know what is the budget of the COMAR, which is the asylum system of Mexico today? $2 million. $2 million to deal with and they have according to their own calculation, the number of applicants at this point today, minimum, is 120,000 per year. Most of the budget, the additional budget, is paid by United Nations, by the UN Refugee Agency of United Nations. The full number of employees working for this asylum mechanism in Mexico is 340 people. 340 people, of which 240 are paid by United Nations. So this is not a credible system. My advice will be for the Biden administration to focus into those kind of issues and to help Mexico to develop a credible, sustainable, capable asylum mechanism, and to treat Mexican as well as the U.S., treat immigrants as people who have real problems. They come to the U.S. and they go through Mexico, and some of them are willing to apply for asylum because they are escaping from real problems. This is not a fiction. And secondly, I think they should learn, especially in Mexico, but also at the border, at the U.S. border, to treat them in a humane way, respecting their dignity and basic human rights.
Thanks, Jose Miguel. Before we go to the audience and take your questions, I can do one round of questions, starting maybe with you, Seynabou, on, looking at COVID, it is striking that when you look at the macroeconomic numbers, Guatemala did not fare that poorly during 2020. So I think Guatemala contracted by 1.5%, more or less. I would say one of the best outcomes in all of the Americas. Obviously, remittances were extremely good. Maybe exports of agricultural goods didn't suffer stoppages like manufacturing, etc. But on the other hand, you look at Honduras. You mentioned the natural disasters, but also Salvador contracted by 8%. What lessons can we pick up from the Guatemala experience there? That would be one. And also, following on your idea of maybe thinking about, let's say, involving the private sector with, let's say, low commitments, because given this whole uncertain environment, you cannot expect big projects, but leveraging on what you already have, like these dams that are almost done, and you can leverage any other ideas, any other areas where the World Bank is helping Central America to try to kickstart a more dynamic economic growth and development process.
No, thank you, Alejandro. Guatemala is an outlier. And it's important to say that when you had a drop of minus 1.5% of growth in Guatemala, Nicaragua had minus 2%, but nobody trusts the numbers of Nicaragua. But what you see in Guatemala is, number one, the remittances, which equate almost 20% of GDP. That's another part of the migration, because this is a system that has been going for such a long time that there is a dependency. Imagine 20% of your GDP. There is no help, no loan, no support from the IMF, the World Bank, any community that can go to 20% of the GDP. That's what people were sending, even despite having no economic activity or lower economic activity in the US. People, even when they were losing their job, they were sending money home. So that's one. Second is, as you said, the resilience of the agriculture sector. Third, I think growth in Guatemala, even the Guatemalan cannot tell you where it comes from. Even when nothing happens, you get a 3% of GDP that is there. But it doesn't translate into less inequality or poverty reduction. It's floating out there. So for any purpose, because I always say growth is not something you eat for lunch or dinner. It doesn't feed you. When you go to the micro level at the people, you do not see that. Second, what is the role of the public sector? You have the redistributive role. When you see how much they're getting out of this growth, Guatemala must be one of the lowest country where you have revenue mobilization. They were at 9%. So which means that even this growth, the state cannot play the role of taking it and using it for social safety net, using it for education program, using it to move that. So what worried me the most during the crisis is how such a small state that was maintained small by design could play a role of lender of last resort when you get the mother of all crises that happens like COVID. All the states, what they did, they run their debt, they run the deficit, and they just stepped up. Gave money, gave $300 to people, make sure that you could maintain a semblance of economic activity so that it could go. In the case of Guatemala, it was the total opposite. So what I'm trying to say, it's not necessarily a replicable system because it's one with its own idiosyncrasy and a very big and empowered private sector with a very small, dysfunctional public sector. I'll just give an example, and it's a pretty sad example if you think about it. I had mentioned that 47% of all children in Guatemala are stunted. They're malnourished. So we have this program where we worked with the government to really put malnutrition at the top of the development program with a program called Crecer Sano. Let's just grow in a healthy way. So this program has stayed for 4 years at the Congress, including with a 10 million donation that you don't pay, and it's not approved. So even something like that is supposed to help, that dysfunctionality is not something that goes. So when you go to Honduras and El Salvador, there the dynamics are a little bit different compared to what you have in Guatemala. And you're right, you had El Salvador had a dip of about 7.9% and Honduras 9%. Honduras was a little bit more affected. But if any, you could see that that crisis was happening, at least in the case of El Salvador, on a background of a country that had already borrowed a lot. They managed well their fiscal, but the debt was growing like crazy, and they needed to be the lender of last resort. The mother of all crises was coming, so what did they do? They borrowed much more, which means that when they go further, if they look at their budget, the share that they will start having to use to repay the debt will be crowding out what they need to put to invest in their people, to invest in better social protection. So they have this crippling part that they have to do. Honduras worked with the IMF and managed to run one of the most successful fiscal consolidation programs. But while they were doing that and sitting very vulnerable, they cut their investment. So in health and education, no capacity, no nothing. So they were almost sitting there, and they let the electricity company continue to run subsidy and ask them. So what I'm trying to say is that even though They ended up trying to rebound this year from that crisis. They have vulnerability that will cripple the recovery. And it's going to be really fundamental to make sure that what happened during COVID, which was really a focus on people, being there for the people, being there for them in terms of giving them food, giving them safety net, giving them education and health, that focus is not lost. As you know, the recovery is about consolidating, the recovery is about cutting. It will have to be also about finding new ways to generate revenue, new ways to invest wisely with good return, and new ways to really continue to put people first. Because if you don't people first, they will vote with their feet, and they will risk their life even if they die trying. So let me stop there.
So also what you're saying is that the role of the private sector should also be to pay a little bit more taxes. And in Guatemala, 10%.
Guatemala, it's obvious.
Yeah.
So I think in the case of El Salvador, you have this fight between the government of Nayib Bukele and the traditional Arena party, which is the big private sector. But there, I want to make a small distinction, and I will not go long on that, is that when people talk about private sector, they always think about the big established private sector. You know, the big, how do they call them, Guatelatinas, no? Where you have your Pollos Campero, your Intercontinental. Actually, Central America is really the home of all these big, vibrant multinationals, whether you look at CIMAN, whether you look at all these big groups. So they have entrepreneurs. But let's think about the small private sector, the one that creates the SMEs of the US. That really create jobs, but jobs that are not subsistent jobs, jobs that will grow to get into the middle, jobs that can get from informality to formal, that can harness really that positive cycle. So I'm saying private sector, but let's look also at the small private sector.
No, thanks. Catherine, I mean, you mentioned climate change, and you also mentioned, civil wars being, let's say, the big shock that initiated the migratory process from Central America to the US that then became self-sustaining. What is your view of the size of the impact that climate change can have in the migration process? It could be as large as what we saw with the civil wars. What are, your studies, your colleagues' studies, saying regarding the link between their projections for the next 20 years in terms of climate change and migration in Central America that's vulnerable?
The United Nations recently, maybe last year or the year before, generated a projection that said by 2050, you're looking at least 300 million clearly forced out because of climate change. Now, again, this whole conversation about climate is complicated because some people, when they talk about climate change impacts, they're talking about weather impacts, right? And more storms, more drought. But as we know, there are other kinds of environmental impacts that also go on. And so most people believe that number is an underestimate. Now, that's for the world, right? And there are no projections that I know of that are specific to this region. We certainly know there are, exogenous shocks, right, in the form of storms that happen on a regular basis in Central America and in Mexico, frankly. And then we also know that there's a lot of infrastructure, as you mentioned, dams. There's a lot of infrastructure that's half built, that is or it was fully built, but it's deteriorating and it's not being maintained. And then that has environmental impacts in the form of climate change, making the situation worse, right? Exacerbating those conditions, or just on their own. So I think that the climate displacement, the environmental displacement is going to be increasingly now something that we talk about. And I think you can see the vulnerability when you look at just how different these three countries have weathered COVID and their conditions even right prior to COVID. Whether we think about political and governance issues, whether we think about development, economic issues, or more social issues like, child nutrition, right? Which you would think would be an easy win, right, for the country to vote in this program. So I do think the you know, it's a negative. It's not a very positive view in the short run in terms of displacement. There's going to be much more environmental displacement and climate change. If I could just mention, I really loved your comment about investing, you know, having the Biden administration invest differently in the migration system in Mexico. Because what I didn't say, because I didn't want to overly emphasize what most people in this room know, which is migration policy in the US has been almost fully about enforcement. And enforcement inside the US, at the border, and now increasingly to the south in Mexico. And in Guatemala now, to a certain extent as well. But there are some, and so I do think investing in Mexico in a different way, right, in the protection system makes a lot of sense. And the numbers are very meager, 300, and I knew it was just over 300, you know, for Colmar, right? It's crazy. But there are some small private sector projects going on in Mexico. And I can't really speak in detail, but I have a proposal out. And this is to evaluate one of them, where the private sector, there are a few supporters in Mexico who are paying for people to be moved, if they want to be, families who are at the Guatemala-Mexico border and have a protection claim in, who can be moved to areas of Mexico, mostly northern Mexico, where there are jobs. And people are being paid subsidies, you know, in year 1 to go, then in year 2 to stay, and they're given jobs that are in the formal sector. They're not informal sector jobs for at least one main breadwinner in the family. And there's only been about a few hundred cases so far, but the initial look that I have of those data look very promising. The investment looks fairly low. Although you need the Mexican government to be involved because there's the issue of work permits and all of that, and of course housing. But that's a promising avenue that I think could also grow with U.S. support.
Jose Miguel, I don't know if you want to say anything else regarding how the U.S. can foster a more efficient, a more modern migration system, or if you, I mean, listening to you, I mean, it looks like the challenge to try to rebuild institutions in the region is unsurmountable. But what could be the examples in other countries that we should be looking at to try to start thinking on how to help these 3 countries, these 4 or 5 countries, strengthen the rule of law, their institutions, to at least stop the backtracking that is going. That it also seems that the migration process is generating a very negative feedback loop, you know, because the people, somebody was mentioning, Catherine, that a lot of the people that are leaving, it's lower middle class. So the population that would trigger change and resist these issues, it's leaving the country. So how do you break this cycle? How do you try to stop this backtracking?
Again, there are no easy solutions, and there is all, in my view, a very old prescription here, and that is to strengthening the rule of law. I mean, it sounds like, you know, pretty obvious, but a country like Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras today, where you don't have an independent judiciary, and the rule is impunity and corruption. And Bukele, for instance, just passed legislation because he controlled Congress, according to which anyone who could be under investigation for anything related to acquisition of materials or even vaccines during the pandemic, during the COVID, should be immune from prosecution. What do you think is the message? You know, the message is to protect members of the government for any potential scrutiny. And that was passed by the Bukele's legislation. He controlled Congress. Now they are trying to backtrack, and they say, that they will introduce some changes because this obviously created some strong reaction from the Biden administration as well as from European allies. But without pressure, international attention, international pressure, it's very little what you could do. Bukele is already working on changing the constitution of El Salvador. And we know what that means. Chavez did that, in Venezuela. That is, it's the classic script of populist leader who control, everything in their hands, the judiciary. They go after the media as, fake news. They go after civil society. Bukele passed legislation now that established that any member of a civil society, it could be a religious organization, whatever, getting financial support from outside should register as a foreign agent. Similar legislation as the Russian and the Putin legislation, foreign agent. And that contribution should be taxed 40%. So you have the Ford Foundation or Open Society Foundation or any kind of foundation, Rockefeller Foundation or a religious organization trying to donate to an organization that is fighting for the environment, for women's rights, for children's rights, for indigenous rights. In El Salvador, 40% of that contribution should go to the government. So it's the classic model where the name of the game is accumulate power, and asphyxiate civil society, the media. Is very important to intimidate the media, and the judiciary, of course, and change the constitution. So that, and what is the job of the international community? Means Washington, European Union, and some few democracies in Latin America, because we can't count on Bolsonaro for this, few democracy, leaders. When we have problems in the region, we look to Washington. Otherwise, we have local leaders, like Fernando Henrique Cardoso, for instance, in Brazil, who are willing to step up and defend these rights. Today, it's very hard to find somebody who could help.
And thanks for making it not only the president for Central America, but also for the region as a whole. So let us turn to the audience, and I'm pretty sure there are lots of questions.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
My name's Amelia Espinosa, and I'm a second year in the Latin American Studies program. And so we've talked about how the Northern Triangle struggles with poverty and malnutrition, and how there's a need to invest in infrastructure and human capital. But we also mentioned how the poorest of the poor are trapped. They can't migrate. And so how do you frame the US or other world powers investing in the Northern Triangle when we know it'll likely lead to a surge in migration that at least would be unpopular in the short term? That could potentially mean also investing in a model like Professor Donato mentioned, of redistribution or regional approach. But I'm just wondering if there's a way that we could frame investing in Latin America in a way that's popular in the United States, other than a human rights narrative that tends not to be successful. Thank you.
Okay. I remember just before COVID, the excitement was that all the countries thought that Amazon would come relocate there. And they were preparing their regulation. They were trying to think about, okay, how can you do temporary work with the regulation? How can you do work from home and all of that? And I remember when Intel went to Costa Rica, even when it left, the impact stayed in terms of, getting into medical device, increasing the sophistication of their product. I think that there's a part of a conversation that really has to do with what can the public sector do to attract companies that, foreign companies that can come and open shop there and create jobs and all of that. Just the perspective of it started putting this whole regulatory spin of what do they have to do to win that beauty contest and do that. So there's one part. So that was quite interesting to watch and see. One day it would be El Salvador, the next day it would be Costa Rica, and so on. But beyond that, you have a whole very vibrant conversation about how post-COVID global value chains are changing. And they are the whole nearshoring, the whole fact that no matter what we say, they're right here. They're right next in the south of the U.S. It's so easy to go from there. How to make sure that you build the skills, you build the regulation, you build the competition, and you allow them to do that. So there are companies that were able to do that. Costa Rica was able to do that and really improve in their productivity in how they're doing things. Are there lessons to be learned there? What does it mean in terms of governance, in terms of predictability in the regulatory environment? It's sad to say, but just before the crisis in Nicaragua, investors would rather invest in Nicaragua than invest in the other country because they will tell you, at least I know if I put my money there, where it would go out. So those are things that companies value because they're like, okay, we know what will happen and what are the proceedings to if something happens. I think that's continuous. Human capital, upskilling, using digital to make sure that you are responding to the skills that are there. I know that, for instance, Medellin in Colombia did that. They completely reinvented the city, took it out of the dominion of basically the narco-traffickers and recreated it as a hub for creativity. There are different things that are being done, but the question is seeing within the context what works, upscaling it, and selling that value proposition. And that is happening also at the energy level, for instance, as we're doing this transition, how to make sure that you're building a greener, cleaner transition matrix. And there's an opportunity for some firms, big firms in the US working with OPIC and all of that, trying to find a way to do that. There are many ways. I think the difficulty is the scaling up, which require really a massive effort on the education front, a massive effort on the risk front, a massive effort on the institution so that people feel confident that, okay, if I send my money there, I know what return I will have and what it means.
Another question. Sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah,
no, I have
see you. Yeah.
just right at the back. Hi, my name is Diana. I'm Diana Paz. I'm in first year of the conflict resolution program. Just to pick up on your last point, Mr. Vivanco, on spreading the rule of law, as you said, the topic can be a little bit redundant, but particularly in this region, what is the role of the international community, particularly as we have seen initiatives such as CIGID or MACA die in the last years? What can the international community really do? Are we looking at more hybrid models? Are we looking at sanctions? I know it's not the topic of our conversation, but it's our neighbor, Nicaragua, and seeing how we overcome this crisis, and maybe sanctions are not the way. So if I can push you on this topic, since we have touched a lot on the economic part, what do we do with these countries where more than 90% of the cases rest in impunity, and what is our role as an international community, either as a World Bank or Human Rights Watch, or more generally? Thank you.
You mentioned CICIG, right, in Guatemala. I'm going to be brief. One day, I was in my office many years ago, and somebody said I was calling on behalf of the president of Guatemala. I thought that was a joke, so I finally answered the phone, and indeed was the president of Guatemala. His last name was Portillo. I have never met this fellow, and he said, we have many problems in Guatemala with mafias and corruption and human rights. Can you come to Guatemala and help me to figure out what will be the right solution? So I said, look, we don't do that. We don't offer advice to governments, especially with questionable background, to offer them some sort of quick solutions. We travel to the countries and evaluate human rights conditions there, but not necessarily. Well, he pressed really, really hard. I finally agreed to do that. I traveled to Guatemala with a couple of colleagues. We met with him, and he said, you know, give me any solution, anything, you know. So, you know, but you know, the trouble is that, in my view, I'm going to be very frank here again and politically incorrect. Guatemala is a swamp. That is what I believe. You know, it's really hard to build something on a swamp, you know, because corruption, because how weak are the institutions and the interconnection of the mafias. So my conclusion after having a meeting with the president, then I said, you know, I'm going to meet with everyone here, the Supreme Court, this, you know, the opposition, et cetera, et cetera. I concluded that there was not an easy solution for Guatemala because the only solution was to bring somebody from outside, you know, Guatemala, with the support of the United Nations, and to create an entity that with, you know, police officers, law enforcement people, experts in anti-corruption investigations, foreigners, with the authorization of the state to investigate, you know, pretty high-level crimes that could involve members of the administration. I made a proposal. It was accepted. We after a week, you know, this was very quick, you know, and we made even a ceremony in front of the whole, all the ambassadors, so, you know, based in Guatemala. The foreign minister was present, the president was present. Everybody commit to create this entity that will come to Guatemala to investigate crimes. We left Guatemala with the sense that mission has been accomplished. Nothing happened, you know, nothing, zero. And for several years, it took a different government to implement that idea. Finally, under Kofi Annan, this was established, an international entity with the capacity, this is completely revolutionary, to investigate crimes, all sorts of crimes. And this entity was able to, for instance, investigate the president of Guatemala, the guy who invited me to visit the country, who ended up in prison, extradited to the US, in prison, federal prison, for stealing $25 million from the a fund created by United Nations to support education for indigenous community. So he grabbed that money, he put that money in his, but fortunately, this entity investigated the crime, and he ended up extradited and spent a couple of years, I believe, in the federal prison in the US for that transaction. Now, that entity did the most for Guatemala in 100 years. Unfortunately, there was a big conspiracy by the private sector in Guatemala and by the mafias in Guatemala with the support of former Vice President Pence and Senator Marco Rubio to get rid of that entity. And there is no more international investigators of those kind of endeavors in Guatemala. I do believe that that is a very concrete, successful experience in one of these countries that hopefully could be one day replicated.
Thanks.
What do we do now? We have seen that initiative die out also, as well as the mission against corruption in Honduras by the Organization of American States. Like, since this hybrid internationalized persecution models are failing, and clearly there's no political will, what do we do in the meantime while we wait for another president to call you up to see how they're going to solve microcriminality?
But it's virtually impossible to expect that something could be done seriously in Honduras when the president is accused of narco-trafficking and his family. So I think it's ludicrous, it's disingenuous to expect some, and as a matter of fact, they had some experiments similar to CICIG in Honduras, in a connection for 4 years with the Organization for American States. Nothing happened. You know, it was a total failure. So, you know, one day you will find somebody willing to create this type of mechanisms, but they will make sure that any entity investigating crimes, all sort of crimes, not just corruption, and narco trafficking as well, and et cetera, they don't have the power to do that. I think the experience of Guatemala was too traumatic for the mafias of Central America.
So there's 2 questions here at the front.
Hi, my name is Angeli. I'm from Panama. So I grew up experiencing all of the problems discussed here firsthand. And I was wondering, what's something that you would account as progress made by these countries? Or how can you give us hope for the future of politics for countries like Panama, Honduras? So yeah.
I think that is a question for you.
Whoever was it.
I think you have to speak about the development in Panama, right? One of the things we haven't done is we haven't mentioned Panama, right? And we haven't, and I've been sitting here thinking about, we're not mentioning Panama, which is, I'm not an expert on Panama, right? But it is very different. In some ways, as you said earlier, Costa Rica in the region is different. Panama is also quite different. And at this very moment, right, experiencing many migrants coming in through the Darien Gap, and again with U.S. help, enforcement-related help, but nonetheless, people losing their lives. The cartels, the gangs are operating throughout the Gap, and to some extent, throughout the country. And so I don't really know what to say about Panama, except that from my vantage point as an international migration scholar and someone who contributes to policy conversations all the time, Panama is interesting because it has been fairly stable politically, and it has, clearly with the canal, it's got a lot of development past and future, lots of funds coming in. And now is the moment that, in my opinion, is somewhat different, because up until now, the migration story into Panama has been highly skilled, engineers, doctors, whatever, coming from all over the Americas into Panama. And, recently, the last 10 or 15 years, many Venezuelans. But now I think Panama's feeling some stress that it hasn't felt before in any significant way. I'm not really sure what the implications are of that, but I'm watching it carefully. I don't know. You want to speak about the conditions in country?
Yes, I want to talk about the inclusion agenda, because if you just look at the pure growth agenda, Dominican Republic and Panama are the superstars. Like, they're growing like crazy. And what is really there, I think the challenge is really inclusion, because you have 2-3 Panamas. If you go to the north of Panama, Madre de Dios, Colón, all these areas that are black areas, that's where they filmed the James Bond movie that was supposed to represent Haiti. So you have first world country, and honestly, the administration of the canal is first world. And then you have part where you still have development issue of the most fragile country. So how do you bridge that gap? You go, for instance, to the Darien area, to the Emberas territories. Water is a problem. I remember at the beginning of COVID, we were saying, you have to wash your hand. They're like, we have the soap, but we don't have the water. So how do you get so much and so little? I think that's really the challenge of our time. How can we see those big gaps in terms of the have and the have-not, and what does it mean? And I think that also gets into what type of country do you want to have? Where do you want to live? What type of dream? What type of capacity? Because while you were also getting, engineer all this skilled immigration into Panama, what was the capacity of the government? Because what happens in those cases, you have Excellence Hub, and how do you make sure that you are building the infrastructure so that people can really give services and give them across the board and connect road and connect skills and bring investment and do all of that. When you're asking about the way forward, because I would hate to finish that giving you the impression that, you know, we spend a wonderful hour and a half just bemoaning all the things that are not working. And we are in development because we believe that there is a way. And you guys are the future of it. If everybody shakes their hands and just pull their hair, then I think we're going to a worse world. If anything, you do have those excellence centers. And for me, for instance, it's a lot about looking at those subnational government or those municipalities that find a way to really get around corruption issues. And you have some of those. What did they do? How did it work? And how are they? Can you scale them up? What are the positive deviants? We are so focused on the negative deviants and on the average bleakness that we're not looking at these bright spots. Where are those bright spots? How do we evaluate them? How do we replicate them? How do we bring them to scale? And how do we make sure that we have this saying, how do we make sure that you have this granite block of weak institution corruption? How do you make sure that you're chipping at it and in ways that over time it becomes much weaker and it falls? How do you do that? How do you make sure that you're thinking about it in a global way? For instance, we've talked a lot about the migrant. We haven't talked about how can you use the diaspora that is here to reinvest back in productive sector. That's a huge area, whether we're talking diaspora bond, whether we're talking conditional cash transfer. People don't want to send money home for people to stay at home, don't go to school, don't study, and just get the higher reserve utility for working. So how do you do this connection so that it becomes also a tool for development? So there are many positive things. I think that it's really important that we are all vested in upscaling them and helping them really be an instrument of change.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Thank you for coming. My name is Nico Cafati. I'm from Honduras. I really learned a lot from what you said, even though I'm being from the region. So all of you said that there's a lot of problems in the region. The international community can't intervene directly because of state sovereignty. We can't go in and just change things the way we want. So my question to you was, and as someone who has tried to work with the private sector, with organizations, how can the international community empower the people who actually want to do things in these countries to change things from within, given that they can't do it directly with the governments like it was mentioned before?
Well, state sovereignty does not apply for human rights. You understand that? I mean, and fundamental freedoms and unorganized crime. I mean, there is a lot of space for the international community to act effectively and to support the rule of law. There are universal values here involved. And unfortunately, conditions, I mean, I would be happy to give you good news, but I have to report to you what is happening on the ground. And conditions are actually worse than before, and I think are getting worse. Unless there is a fundamental change, it's very difficult to produce change from outside if the countries and the people of those countries keep electing this type of leaders. It's very, very difficult. You know, you could try to support civil society, but that is obviously on the margins. I mean, what kind of civil society, what kind of impact a group of citizens could have documenting abuses against children or women or indigenous or Afro or LGBT community in Central America? Some is better than nothing, you know. But what is pathetic is the quality of leadership in that region and in the rest of the region in Latin America. So we are going through tough times, but I think it's important to have the right diagnosis and not just some sort of nice picture about potentials and things that could, might have some impact. The diagnosis should be accurate, should reflect the problems, should explain why we have this migration, because that is actually the subject of this conversation, and why this migration keep, growing without any future, any hope in those regions of Latin America. And if we want to do something, the problem is not simple. It will require, a huge effort and joint ventures between, the government and the authorities there. I don't think there is a way that you could avoid to work with the government. Through private sector, you could do some, but if you don't have real partners locally, it's really, really tough.
Let me just add that this regional approach to migration, the task force and the World Migrant and Refugee Council, the idea that this is a region from Canada to Costa Rica, and yes, there is national sovereignty, we know that, but as you suggest, scaling up, there are some countries in this region from Canada, Costa Rica, that are doing better than others with respect to migration, that there's some areas where there's some innovation. And how can we scale that up across the region? And not that you can never get rid of national sovereignty. You can't, at least not in the world we live in. But you can move. Maybe it's on the issues that you suggest, human rights, but you can move forward regionally in some ways that I think are important by talking regionally. It is kind of surprising that the U.S. shares a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. And I think it was only in the late 1980s when Mexico and the US started formally talking about migration at the border. There was a formalized mechanism. I mean, what happened to the rest of the 20th century, right? So don't underestimate, especially the future here in this audience, the ability to think regionally about some of these very sticky, difficult, challenging problems.
Well, let me thank, a great panel, all of you, coming today to discuss these issues. Let me thank you for joining us today. And let me just, conclude with those ideas, because although the diagnosis is pretty complicated and we're not painting a bright future, all of them continue to work in the region with hope that eventually change will come. And I think there's small and bigger initiatives that eventually coalesce. What Jose Miguel said about CIGIC. Eventually it happened, and it had an impact, and maybe it will happen again. And what Seynabou is doing with the World Bank, in different countries, is having an impact. It's creating a conscience, and the work that Catherine is doing actually is generating the right diagnosis, the right proposals to improve the migration system in the U.S., and one day, those things might happen through the political process. So I think it's more a call for many of you to work on these issues, to work with your counterparts in the region. And eventually there's a shock, there's good leadership that comes to power, and things can get done, and that will actually generate development, no? So thank you very much, and please, a round of applause.